It was Thanksgiving, and I pulled up to the driveway, with the low rumble of my truck echoing across the gravel. The scent of pine from the nearby woods mingling with the faint aroma of wood smoke drifting from the chimney. In my gloved hand, I held a bottle of aged scotch, 12 years single malt, its label worn just enough to hint at value. And I wore my cleanest flannel shirt, the one Alina liked to call respectable against the riffraff, and a pair of polished leather boots that thudded against the gravel. As I stepped out, I could hear laughter filtering through the house, muffled voices, polite clinks of glassware, and the soft hum of Elena's family greeting one another. Normally, a holiday at her parents' felt like stepping into a carefully choreographed performance, where every guest was a prop and every smile had been cross-checked for authenticity. Today, though, I wasn't sure which role I was expected to play. My heart thudded against my ribs with a familiar mix of pride and unease as I walked up to the front door. Alina stood there slender in a tailored dress that matched her mother's preference for neutral tones, beige, champagne, and the occasional flash of gold in her jewelry. Her hair was pinned back perfectly, not a strand out of place. She met my eyes without smiling, and motioned with a gesture as crisp as a conductor's baton. "Guests are arriving through the front," she said, her voice low but clear. "You've been working. You understand, right?" I swallowed the lump in my throat. My mind flickered to the dozen emails I'd sent before dawn, spreadsheets tracking rent rolls, invoices for new repairs, and meeting notes with the city building department that would finalize permits on a project I'd poured blood and sweat into. Exhaustion tugged at my shoulders, but I straightened up, lifting my chin. "I understand," I said, keeping my voice steady. I lifted the scotch and offered it to her as an olive branch. She didn't hesitate. She took it from my hand and our fingers brushed briefly, an electric moment I recognized but refused to acknowledge. I nodded and pivoted away from the front entrance. Gravel crunched under my boots as I circled around the side of the house, noticing the new landscaping her father had insisted on. Trimmed hedges, manicured shrubs, and a cobblestone pathway laid last summer, which Elena's parents treated like a grand statement to their refined taste. I felt a familiar pang of irony. All that effort to craft an image of gentle affluence while they thought they controlled every narrative about my life. Where I came from, what I did for a living, how I wasn't truly one of them. Approaching the kitchen door, I paused and took a deep breath. The cold air filled my lungs, mingling with the warmth that seeped from the house. I lifted my boots onto the threshold, stepping inside like one of the hired help they thought I might be. My flannel and boots made the uniform feel real. In that moment, I tasted the tension in my own mouth, equal parts bitterness and resolve. I shut the door behind me, and the dinner party den rose to greet me. Silverware clattering, voices raised in polite laughter. I slid into the kitchen, the wall of warmth and chatter washing over me. The kitchen island was a granite slab anchored in the middle of a spotless stainless steel workspace. I eased onto one of the high stools, my back ramrod straight, feeling every eye on me. Though no one acknowledged my presence, I set my scotch down and unbuttoned my flannel at the collar, loosening the tension in my neck. My eyes flicked to the row of turkey platters on the counter, cranberry relish in a crystal bowl and mashed potatoes steaming in a huge white tin. The scent of roasting meat clung to the air, laced with sage and rosemary. I thought of the jokes Alina's parents would crack in a few minutes about how their son-in-law still thought people like me needed to prove something by carrying expensive liquor as a peace offering. I looked up when her mother, Cynthia, swept into the kitchen, her eyes glinting behind a string of pearls that probably cost more than my truck. She paused when she saw me sitting there, leaning back to smooth her heavy cardigan. "Oh," she started, forcing a polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I didn't realize you'd, opted for kitchen service today." She gestured toward the dining room, where chandeliers hung like jeweled pendants from the ceiling, casting a soft glow over every polished surface. The table was set for a dozen, with silk and napkins folded into art and crystalline wine glasses waiting to be filled. I kept my expression neutral. "I'm just making sure everything's taken care of," I said. My words were as cool as ice. But beneath that, my pulse hammered. I'd been to enough events here to know what she meant. I was to be invisible until they needed me to refill platters or pour wine. I ended the top button of my flannel further. "Looks like you've got plenty of help," I added, nodding toward the cluster of catering staff entering with trays of hors d'oeuvres. Her lips pursed. She tilted her head toward the pantry. "Frank," she began, using the name Elena's father reserved for me when he thought no one else was listening, "will manage." And then she swept past, glossy heels clicking, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I took a swig of scotch, burning, smoky, exactly how I liked it, and let it steady me. My reflection stared back from the stainless steel backsplash. Dark eyes narrowed, a strong jawline set with determination, and a hint of anger bubbling beneath the surface. I turned my attention to the countertop, where a half-finished turkey sandwich lay wrapped in wax paper, the edges of the bread soaked with juices and gravy. I unwrapped it, my fingers brushing the soft crust, and took a bite. The bread was dry despite the moisture from the meat, and I felt a flicker of satisfaction. If they wanted to pretend I was a servant, I could dwell in their kitchens for a while. Maybe let them forget that I was the one who owned the building they claimed as their family home. No one greeted me. The guests walking from the foyer to the dining room paused to stare as I chewed, confusion flickering in their eyes. Alina's parents, Margot and Marcel, were entertaining a small group of neighbors in the next room, their voices rich with forced cordiality. I heard them laughing about non-essential things. The weather, how Connie from down the street had brought the best pumpkin pie, how Marcel's golf game still wasn't what it used to be. A laugh bubbled behind my ribs, bitter and precise. They'd laughed at me for years, calling me blue-collar lucky at family barbecues, suggesting I find a real job when I explained commercial real estate was my passion. They never invited me into their world. They just never let me leave their judgment. I swallowed the rest of the sandwich, enjoying the sensation of tearing into something they thought was beneath me. They hadn't invited me to join the festive tableau in the dining room, dancing under those glittering chandeliers. Instead, they relegated me to a corner of the kitchen island, like a background character in the story they wanted to tell their acquaintances. But I wasn't merely the help, wasn't. I glanced at the framed photos on the refrigerator. Pictures of Elena's family vacations to Vail, the annual New Year's Eve gala, where my name wasn't whispered in polite circles. They didn't know who I truly was. They didn't know I had built an empire of commercial properties across the state. That my company, Rhodes and Lynn Property Group, held leases that paid for those chandeliers. I took another sip of scotch, feeling liquid courage burn its way down my esophagus. In a few moments, the doorbell would ring again and new guests would arrive, each one stepping through that front door under the impression that everyone invited held the same social currency. They believed in the narrative Elena's family had sculpted that I was an outsider, a blue-collar husband who made enough money to keep his wife comfortably in line, but not enough to challenge their supremacy. They didn't know that by the time the mashed potatoes had been cleared, their carefully curated facade would begin to crumble. I placed the empty bottle on the counter and straightened. I reached into my pocket for my phone, thumb hovering over the silent button. I wished for a moment that I could simply send a single text to announce my presence as more than a guest who entered through the kitchen. But that moment belonged to a future I planned carefully, when their pride lay in ruins, and the truth could stand on its own. For now, I finished the last of my sandwich, stood, straightened the collar of my flannel, and waited, silent, unacknowledged, and potent like a glass of scotch placed casually on a table where no one dared take a sip. I was halfway through that dry turkey sandwich, its brittle edges crumbling between my teeth, when I heard the front door open. The sound carried through the house with a kind of authority that demanded everyone pause mid-conversation, mid-laughter, mid-judgment. I didn't even have to turn my head to know who it was. That voice, deep, warm, rich with years of negotiation and command, rolled into the kitchen like a tide, carrying the sin of money and influence with it. "That smell better be your mother's stuffing," the voice boomed, and I felt a smile tug at my lips. Despite the tension that sat like a stone in my stomach, I glanced up just as Terrence Knox stepped into the kitchen, his presence eclipsing the room like a solar flare. His hair, silver at the temples, caught the light from the overhead chandelier, giving him a regal air that matched the tailored navy suit he wore like a second skin. He paused when he saw me, eyes crinkling with familiarity that no one else in that house seemed to share. "Boss," he said, the single word loaded with an easy confidence that carried weight in every boardroom from Boston to San Francisco. The kitchen fell silent. Even the oven seemed to hush its hum. I held his gaze and let the moment breathe. Let it settle like fine dust on an antique shelf. Then I stood, pushing the stool back with a scrape of metal on tile, and extended my hand. "Good to see you, Terrence," I said. My voice calm, the calm of a man who knew the difference between being ignored and being recognized. His grin widened as he clasped my hand in a firm shake, his other hand clapping my shoulder like an old friend. "Didn't expect to see you here today," he said, loud enough for the voices in the dining room to hear. The chandelier rattled as if it had heard something scandalous. The kitchen had grown so quiet, I could hear the faint ticking of the old clock above the pantry door. Behind Terrence, I saw Alina, her face drained of color, like someone had wrung her out like a dish rack. Her mouth hung open, the wine glass in her hand trembling just enough to send a thin thread of liquid down the stem. She stared at me as though I'd suddenly grown horns. Her father, Marcel, stood half in, half out of the dining room, his napkin still in his hand. He let out a nervous, strangled laugh that died in his throat. Her mother, Cynthia, clutched the back of a dining chair like a lifeline. Her knuckles were white. I watched them all, every last one of them, as the words hung there like a noose. "Boss?" Terrence leaned in, oblivious to the tension in the room, or maybe enjoying it. "Listen, that deal we closed in Burlington?" "I can't thank you enough," he said, his voice lower now, though still loud enough for every lurking ear to catch. Rhodes and Lynn made that possible. I've been telling everyone if they want real estate done right in this state, they call you. My chest felt like it might burst from the satisfaction and the slow, seeping ache of a truth finally revealed. I could feel Elena's eyes on me, wide and shocked. I didn't look at her yet. Instead, I shrugged as if it were all in a day's work. "Glad to help," I said, my voice a quiet contrast to the thunderous silence that had fallen. Terrence glanced around, as if just realizing the room's atmosphere had shifted from jovial to stunned. He turned back to me with a puzzled look. "Wait, didn't realize the kitchen was this dead tonight?" he said, gesturing to the turkey and the empty plates. Usually your in-laws keep the caterers on their toes. That last word, caterers, hit the air like a punch. Alina's mother inhaled sharply, her eyes darting to her husband, who looked like he'd just bitten into a lemon. Alina's lips parted, but no sound came out. I felt something old and buried, some mixture of humiliation and vindication twist in my gut. For years they treated me like the help, like the handyman who got lucky. They'd let their condescension slip into every conversation, every dinner invitation. Now, Terrence's grin was the exclamation point at the end of a sentence I'd been writing in silence. I turned my head slowly, my eyes locking onto Alina's. Her mouth moved, searching for a word, an explanation, anything that would smooth over this moment. But there was no smoothing it over. The wineglass in her hand slipped a fraction lower, her fingers trembling against the delicate stem. Her father's laugh, when it came, was brittle and too quick. "Well, that's quite the surprise," he stammered. "Didn't realize you two were so close." Terrence turned his head toward Marcel, his eyebrows shooting up in amusement. "Close," he echoed. "Hell, I wouldn't have made half the deals I did this year without Rhodes and Lynn behind me. Your son-in-law here's got an empire that most people would kill to be part of." The room shuddered under the weight of that word. Empire. My heart beat faster as I scanned the faces around me. Alina, her parents, the cousins and family friends lurking just beyond the kitchen doorway. Each expression was a cocktail of disbelief, envy, and the slow dawning horror that maybe they'd misjudged the man they tried to sideline. I crossed my arms over my chest, letting the strength of that truth settle into my bones. For the first time that night, I felt tall, really tall, like every inch of me was standing on top of every insult they'd ever thrown my way. Terrence didn't notice the tension. Maybe he did, and just didn't care. He leaned closer, his voice dropping conspiratorially. "Listen, boss. I've got a couple projects coming up that might interest you. I'll text you the details." He clapped me on the shoulder again, then turned toward the dining room, his voice booming. "Hey, don't hog all the stuffing. Save some for me." His voice trailed off as he disappeared into the dining room, leaving the kitchen in stunned silence. I felt every eye turn back to me. Alina stood frozen, her lips pressed together, her eyes bright with something between apology and fear. Her father shifted uncomfortably, his jaw clenched so tight a vein pulsed in his neck. I let the silence stretch, each second a lesson I'd waited years to teach them. Finally, I lifted my chin, letting my eyes find Alina's. I didn't smile, didn't gloat. I just let the truth fill the space between us. I was no longer the man who needed their approval. I was the man they should have never underestimated. She looked at me like she'd never seen me before. Like she didn't know what to do with the reality that had just exploded in the middle of her carefully arranged life. I let her look. I let them all look because now the cracks had started to form, and I wasn't going to stop until the whole facade crumbled. Terrence pulled out one of the high stools beside me and plopped down like he owned the place. His presence felt like a thunderstorm. Electric, unpredictable, a force that drew everyone's gaze. He leaned back and launched into a story about Burlington's biggest new development, weaving details about city permits and high-rise apartments. As if we were the only two people in the room. The kitchen felt like a fishbowl. Every person in the adjacent dining room craning their necks to catch pieces of his tale, their polite conversation evaporating under the weight of his authority. "You know that waterfront deal?" he said, his voice rolling with a casual power that filled the space between us. "I couldn't have closed that without your company. Rhodes and Lynn made the whole thing possible. The city planners were eating out of my hand. Thanks to the paperwork you streamlined, every time I needed a signature, you were there. Every time I needed a permit fast-tracked, you got it. And let's not forget that little union hiccup, poof, gone in a day. He laughed, the sound sharp and full of a pride that belonged to both of us. Though I knew better than to let it show. Alina stood by the sink, her hands trembling on a glass she'd been rinsing for too long. Water dripped steadily into the sink, the rhythmic patter filling the silence between his words. Her father, Marcel, leaned in the doorway, his jaw slack and his eyes darting between me and Terence. Her mother, Cynthia, clutched a dish towel like a lifeline, her knuckles white. You. Marcel's voice cracked like dry wood. You own buildings? His tone was thin, forced, like he was asking about a secret he'd rather not hear confirmed. I took a slow bite of stuffing from the plate in front of me. Its earthy richness, sage, butter, the faint tang of onion, filled my mouth, grounding me. I swallowed, and met his eyes with the same calm I'd practiced for years. Several, I said, my voice slow but steady, every syllable carved from the granite of my own resolve. Silence. It rippled outward from the kitchen like a stone dropped into a still lake, spreading shock and discomfort in its wake. The dining room beyond seemed to have turned to stone. All eyes on us, every breath suspended. I saw Elena's sister, Grace, her lips parted, wine glass frozen halfway to her mouth as if she'd been caught mid-sentence. I saw Uncle Ron, who'd once called me just a guy who lucked into Elena's good graces, his face slack with disbelief. Terence, oblivious or delighting in the show, leaned forward and slapped his palm on the counter. Hell, I trust Rhodes and Lynn with any deal I've got. Nobody knows the ins and outs of property management like you. Even my competitors are calling me asking who's handling my buildings. I tell them straight, talk to him. He's the reason I'm ahead of schedule and under budget. The words crackled through the air, louder than any accusation, sharper than any insult they'd ever thrown my way. I could see it written across every face. The realization that they'd been talking to a man they dismissed too easily. That the blue-collar guy with the flannel shirt and the boots wasn't just Elena's husband, but the reason they'd all enjoyed a cushy Thanksgiving in a house whose foundation I could have bought and sold a dozen times over. Elena's mother's lips trembled, her voice barely a whisper. We, she started, but the words died in her throat. Her gaze flicked to Marcel, seeking some explanation, some apology that would make this easier to swallow. But Marcel had none to give. His eyes were locked on me like he'd just discovered a wolf in his dining room, one he'd mistaken for a stray dog. I let the silence stretch. I let it breathe because power isn't about shouting. It's about letting the truth settle so deeply in a room that it changes the air itself. Terence, in his unstoppable way, kept talking. Remember the Burlington project? He said, his voice lifting in pitch as if the memory itself were a trophy. I had those city inspectors crawling up my ass. Pardon my French, he added with a wink toward Cynthia, who blanched. And who handled it? This guy. He knows every zoning law, every loophole, every commissioner's secretary by name. He's the man you want in your corner. Trust me. He turned back to me, eyes gleaming. And hey, I owe you a dinner, big guy. Whatever you want. Name the restaurant. Ruth's Chris Trattoria Rustica. Anywhere. I smiled. Just a small tilt of my lips, the kind that never reached my eyes. I'll take you up on that, I said. And I would, because I'd earned every inch of respect he was giving me. Elena's eyes burned holes in the side of my head. I could feel her gaze like a brand. She'd wanted me to stay small, to slip through the back door, to sit quietly in the kitchen while her family passed judgment from their crystal kingdom. And now she saw that the man she'd married wasn't the man she'd invited to dinner. He was something else, something she'd never quite grasped. Terrence leaned back and stretched, oblivious to the tension, his grin broad and toothy. "Man, I didn't expect to run into you here. Thought you'd be too busy signing contracts to come to this." "No offense, Cynthia." He gestured at the house with a casual flick of his wrist. She flinched. "No offense," she muttered, but her voice trembled. Terrence's grin turned sly. "Well, I'm glad you're here," he said, slapping the counter one last time before hopping off the stool. "This place could use a little real power in the room." He gave me a wink, then sauntered off toward the dining room, leaving a trail of stunned silence in his wake. I turned to face the wreckage he'd left behind. Alina's mother was blinking rapidly, as if trying to wake from a dream. Marcel was still frozen in the doorway, his napkin now crumpled in his hand. Alina herself looked like she'd been hit by a tidal wave, her mouth opening and closing as though the right words might swim into existence if she tried hard enough, but there were no right words. I set down my plate and stood, my boots scraping the tile. I let my gaze sweep the kitchen, the dining room beyond. Every face that had ever called me lucky or blue-collar or the one who married up. They'd never bothered to ask who I really was, what I'd built, how many families relied on the buildings I owned for their homes and businesses. They'd never asked because they'd never cared to look beyond the man who'd taken the back door at their request. Now they knew. And I wasn't done yet. That night, I left before dessert. I didn't even bother with the pumpkin pie or the pecan tarts they always bragged about. I pushed through the front door, not caring if anyone noticed. The porch lights cast harsh shadows on the steps, my boots echoing with every step I took down the walkway. I didn't turn around. Let them watch me leave? Let them wonder how a man who'd been ignored for years could command the attention of Terran Knox and the respect that came with him. Elena's call started almost as soon as I got in the truck. The first one buzzed against my leg before I even pulled onto the main road. I ignored it, staring at the windshield where raindrops had started to streak the glass like tears. The second call came 5 minutes later. I let it ring until it went silent. Then again and again. Her name glowed on the screen like a brand. But I didn't pick up. I needed space. I needed air. I needed to remember who I was before all this. Before the forced smiles, the casual humiliations, the dismissals that left bruises you couldn't see. At home, I sat in the living room with the lights off. The darkness like a thick coat I couldn't take off. My boots were still on, leaving wet prints on the hardwood. I didn't care. I leaned back into the couch, letting the quiet settle. My mind replayed every scene from that night. The way her father's face had gone pale when Terrence called me boss. The way her mother's voice had trembled. The way Elena's hand had trembled as she clutched that wine glass. Power isn't loud. It doesn't come with flashing lights or a megaphone. It's quiet like a slow building tide that drowns everything in its path before anyone realizes they should have moved to higher ground. I'd spent years letting them talk, letting them laugh at me, letting them think I was just a man who'd lucked into a woman like Alina. I'd let them think I didn't belong in their world because sometimes silence was easier. Sometimes it was easier to be underestimated, but that was over now. My phone buzzed again. I let it go to voicemail. Then it buzzed once more. A text. I picked it up and read the screen from Alina's mother. "We're sorry about tonight. It's been a long week. Please understand. Understand." What was I supposed to understand? that they treated me like an outsider, a servant in my own life, that they'd forced me through the back door like I didn't deserve to stand in the same room as them. My thumb hovered over the reply button. I wanted to type something in, anything. But nothing felt right. I set the phone down, letting it buzz one more time before I powered it off completely. The next morning, I woke early. A habit. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting long shadows across the floor. I poured a cup of coffee, its warmth, bitter and necessary, and sat at the kitchen table. My inbox was already full. Tenants with questions, property managers with updates, a meeting reminder for the project in Burlington. My life, my empire, the thing they'd all dismissed as luck or a side hustle. I sipped my coffee and smiled. An email popped up from Alina's sister. "You're overreacting. It was just one night. Don't let this ruin everything. Everything." Funny word. Everything to her was brunches and Pilates classes, family barbecues and golf tournaments. Everything to me was the years I'd spent building something that couldn't be taken away with a snide comment or a forced smile. Everything to me was knowing that every time they called me blue-collar, they'd missed the real truth. I was the one who owned the deeds. I didn't reply. Let them think I was silent because I didn't know what to say. Let them think I was still the man who took the back door when they asked. Because power isn't always in the words you say. It's in the words you don't. I got dressed slowly, my boots polished, but still carrying the scuffs of work I was proud of. The mirror reflected a man they didn't recognize, a man they'd never bothered to understand. I combed my hair back, tied the laces tight, and picked up my phone. I scrolled past Elena's missed calls, past her mother's half-hearted apology, past the text from her sister. I paused on Taryn's message from the night before. "Terrence knocks dinner soon. You name the place. Let's talk projects. Let's talk respect." I smiled. I built my world from the ground up. One lease, one deal, one sleepless night at a time. They'd never asked how I did it. They'd never asked what it meant to me to walk into a room like I owned it. Because I did. I stepped out onto the porch, breathing in the cold morning air. My breath fogged in front of me, a visible reminder that I was alive, that I'd made it here on my own. The sky stretched above me, wide and open, full of possibility. They'd always laughed at me. They'd always assumed I'd be the man outside their world. But the truth was simpler than that. I wasn't outside their world. I was their world. I was the foundation they didn't even know they were standing on. And when the storm came, I'd be the only one left with a dry roof. I got in my truck and turned the key, the engine rumbling to life like a promise. I didn't need their approval. I didn't need their apologies. I didn't even need their front door because I knew something they didn't. Every door in their world led to a room I already owned. A week later, Alina's father called me out of the blue. His name flashed across my phone screen with a sense of urgency that made my gut tighten. I hadn't spoken to him since Thanksgiving, hadn't answered any of Alina's calls, hadn't responded to her mother's messages. I'd chosen silence because that's where real power grows. Away from their stage, their applause, their manipulations. But the call came anyway, demanding an audience I wasn't sure I wanted to grant. He sounded almost jovial when I answered. "Hey, son, we'd like to have you over for dinner. You know, just the family, Alina, her mother, and me. No guests, no show, just us." The invitation felt like a setup, but my curiosity got the better of me. I agreed, setting the time and place, my voice steady, giving nothing away. When I pulled into their driveway that night, the house glowed with warm light, as though it had never held a cold welcome. I walked up the front steps this time, boots polished, shirt crisp, the same confidence I'd worn at every negotiation table shining in my eyes. Marcel greeted me at the door with a handshake that felt rehearsed, his smile forced and stretched too wide. Alina hovered behind him, her eyes rimmed with worry, her lips pressed into a tight line like she'd been practicing how to look sorry. Inside, the table was set for 4 white linen napkins, polished silverware, a centerpiece of lilies that looked like they'd come from a florist on short notice. A bottle of wine sat unopened, a decoy for the real reason I was here. Marcel gestured for me to sit, and I obliged, folding into the chair like I belonged at every head table he'd ever hosted. Dinner was a formality. Dried chicken, overcooked asparagus, a side of tension that neither the wine nor the forced small talk could wash away. Marcel waited until the plates were cleared before he leaned back in his chair, his smile suddenly shifting from polite to businesslike. I recognized that smile from boardrooms, the one that comes right before the ask. "We wanted to talk to you about something," he began, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. Alina's eyes darted to him and then back to me, her mouth opening as if to interject. But she stayed silent. Her mother sat stiffly, her wine glass untouched, her fingers trembling slightly as she held it. "Go ahead," I said, my tone flat, unreadable. Marcel cleared his throat. "We've been working on a new development idea, something big. It's an opportunity we think you'd want to be a part of." He paused as though expecting me to jump in to clap him on the back to thank him for including me in his plans. I didn't. I let him keep talking. "It's a mixed-use development downtown," he continued, his voice gathering steam. "Retail on the bottom, apartments on top, maybe some office space if the zoning allows it. The numbers are impressive. The projections look strong. We've got interest from a few investors. But we need a key partner to bring it all together. Someone with experience." He said the word like it tasted sour on his tongue. I watched him carefully. I'd spent years studying people, learning when they were bluffing and when they were bleeding. Tonight, he was both. "And what's my role in this?" I asked, keeping my voice calm like I was discussing a lease renewal instead of a lifetime of respect. Marcel shifted uncomfortably. "Well, obviously you'd bring capital and your contacts, Terrence, others. We bring the land and the design." He slid a manila folder across the table like a bribe. I opened it, scanning the glossy renderings, the financials laid out like a buffet of promises. But all I saw was desperation hiding behind the veneer of opportunity. "Let me get this straight," I said, flipping through the pages. "You want me to risk everything I've built, my company, my reputation on a scheme you just thought of?" Marcel bristled. "It's not a scheme," he said, his tone sharp enough to cut. "It's a family opportunity. We grow together." I met his eyes, letting my gaze hold steady until he shifted under its weight. "Didn't feel like family last Thursday," I said. The memory of that night in the kitchen as fresh as the scotch I'd left untouched. Alina's eyes glistened with tears. She reached for my hand across the table, but I pulled it back before she could touch me. "We just want things to go back to normal," she whispered. "Dad didn't mean to." I shook my head. "Normal for you was me at the kitchen counter while you all laughed in the dining room. Normal was you asking me to use the back door while guests walked through the front. Normal was you never correcting them when they called me lucky like I hadn't built this life with my own 2 hands. Marcel's face reddened, his jaw clenched tight. "You're being dramatic," he snapped. "This is business. You're good at business. Let's put the past behind us." I stood, the chair scraping against the hardwood floor like a final note. "You don't get to put the past behind us just because it's convenient now. I said you built that past. Every time you called me son with that patronizing tone. Every time you smirked when I came home in my work boots. Every time you made me feel like an outsider in my own life. That was you laying the bricks of this moment. Alina's tears spilled over now, her hands trembling as she reached for me again. Please, she said, her voice cracking. We can fix this. I looked at her. Really looked at her. And saw a woman who'd never questioned the story her family told her about who I was. A woman who'd never once asked who I really was or what I'd been building all these years. No, I said quietly. You can't fix this with a dinner invitation and a manila folder. I closed the folder, leaving it on the table like a dead weight. Marcel stared at it, his mouth opened, but no words coming. I turned and walked out, my boots heavy on the polished wood floor. Every step a reminder that I wasn't leaving the way I'd arrived. I walked out the front door, head high. No apologies. No regrets. Because the truth was, I'd never needed their validation. I built my own empire while they built excuses. And tonight, they'd show me exactly who they were and who I'd never be again. It started with a phone call. Anonymous, clipped, a voice I didn't recognize. Mr. Rhodes, this is the housing board. We've had a complaint about one of your buildings on 3rd Street. Something about fire code violations. The voice dripped with forced politeness, but I could hear the undertone. They were fishing for something. I leaned back in my chair, staring out the window at the city skyline, the rooftops of the buildings I'd spent years collecting like trophies. Fire code violations, I repeated, keeping my voice steady. Which one? Unit 214, the voice replied. Papers rustled in the background, the shuffle of someone assembling a half-formed case. We'll be scheduling an inspection. I could hear it then, the rehearsed way. He said, scheduling an inspection? Like he was reading from a script. I thanked him and hung up. A minute later, an email from my insurance agent pinged into my inbox. We've received a few concerning reports about your properties. Anonymous calls. Let's schedule a time to discuss coverage. I felt my pulse quicken, my mind sorting through the possibilities. It wasn't just one complaint. It was the beginning of a pattern, a coordinated effort to make me sweat, to force my hand, to remind me that they still thought they held the strings. I could practically see Marcel's face, his forced smile from the dinner table, the way he presented that family opportunity like it was an olive branch instead of a leash. My phone buzzed again. This time, it was one of my property managers, voiced tight with worry. Hey, boss. I just had a couple tenants call me. Someone's been reaching out to them asking if you've been pressuring them to sign renewals or threatening them about rent. They didn't know what to say, so they called me. What's going on? I exhaled slowly, the bitterness coating my tongue. They were playing the oldest game in the book, sowing doubt, rattling cages, making people question the stability they'd come to rely on me for. But they'd underestimated one thing. I've been documenting every transaction, every email, every signature since the day I bought my first building. Tell them the truth, I said. I've never threatened anyone about rent. I've never pressured anyone to sign anything. I don't need to. My voice was even. But inside, a fire burned. After I hung up, I turned to my computer and pulled up a folder labeled Compliance. It was all there. Maintenance logs, inspection reports, contractor invoices, even photos of every completed repair and upgrade. I learned early on that paperwork was my best shield. Every time someone questioned my integrity, I had proof. I opened another folder, this one labeled Communications. Every letter, every email, every text that confirmed my business was above board. If they wanted to come after me, they'd have to wade through a mountain of receipts and signatures. It wasn't just the calls or the sudden scrutiny from the housing board. The real attack came in whispers. The fake reviews that popped up online, anonymous accounts with no history, leaving one-star ratings with vague accusations. Unsafe building, one read. Manager pressures tenants. Another claimed, fire hazard, stay away. I clicked through them one by one, each as transparent as the last. I knew who was behind them, or at least who'd ordered them. Marcel might not have dialed the numbers himself, but his fingerprints were all over this. He'd underestimated me again, thinking I'd cave under the weight of his campaign. The next morning, I walked into my office. A small, efficient space with exposed brick and tall windows that let the sun pour in. My assistant Kendra handed me a stack of messages. "You've got calls from 3 different agencies asking about your buildings," she said, her brow furrowed. "And someone left this." She slid an envelope across the desk, no name on the front. I picked it up, weighing it in my hand. The seal was cheap, the kind you get in bulk at the office supply store. I tore it open and pulled out a single sheet of paper, a typed list of supposed violations at various properties. No letterhead, no signature, just a bullet-pointed threat. At the bottom, in bold, was one line: "We're watching." I set the paper down, my pulse steady. "Kendra," I said, my voice calm, "call our lawyer. Tell him I want a full review of every property's compliance records and get me a meeting with the city inspector. We're not going to let this sit." She nodded, her eyes wide. "Of course." I leaned back, staring at the paper, the words staring back at me like a dare. This was their move. This was how they thought they'd beat me. By making me doubt my own foundation, by making others doubt me. But they didn't know I'd been building this for years. Brick by brick, file by file, I'd learned the hard way that trust is earned in details. That night, I drove past one of the buildings they targeted, a red brick complex I'd bought, and restored myself. The windows glowed with life. Families eating dinner, kids' laughter floating out from cracked windows. I pulled into the lot, stepped out, and let the night air wash over me. I walked the perimeter, checking the lights, the locks, the pathways. I stopped to chat with Mrs. Alvarez in 102, who'd been living there since before I'd bought the place. She beamed when she saw me. "Mr. Rhodes, everything's good here. I saw someone snooping around earlier, though. Didn't recognize him. Thanks for letting me know," I said, my smile genuine. "If you see anything else, you call me right away." I made my way back to the truck, the night settling heavy on my shoulders. They thought I'd fold under pressure, thought I'd bend because they'd made me feel small once. But they'd forgotten something. I'd built my life on proving people wrong. Alina thought I'd fold. Her father thought I'd beg. They all thought I'd be the man outside their world forever. But what they didn't know was that I'd spent years preparing for storms like this. I'd built every foundation to withstand the worst they could throw at me. I climbed into the truck and turned the key, the engine roaring to life. The headlights illuminated the street ahead. Straight and long, no shadows deep enough to hide me. I wasn't going to run. I wasn't going to hide. I'd faced worse than them, and I'd walked through every fire they'd set for me. I pulled out of the lot, the city rising up around me like a fortress I'd built with my own hands. Let them come. Let them try to tear me down. I'd be ready. Because I wasn't the man who used the back door anymore. I was the man who owned the front. The ad hit the Vermont Business Times on a crisp Tuesday morning. A full-page spread, black and white, no fancy design, just the truth. laid out in bold letters that couldn't be ignored. When family turns into a liability, the cost of trying to destroy your son-in-law. Underneath the headline, I let the evidence speak for itself. Screenshots of the fake reviews, emails from anonymous accounts tracing back to a small PR firm known for smear campaigns. The calls to the housing board logged and time-stamped. Every thread of the web they tried to weave laid bare for anyone with eyes to see. I didn't name names, but I didn't have to. Everyone in that town knew who had tried to bring me down, and the evidence made it all but official. The call started before noon. Tenants, business partners, old colleagues. My phone buzzed like an angry wasp's nest. Most were calls of support, but a few were from reporters eager to sniff out the rest of the story. Terrence called me around lunch. His voice was low, but the respect in it was unmistakable. "You've got some stones," he said. I'd have paid to see the look on Marcel's face when he saw that paper. "And you did it without even dropping his name. That's class." I thanked him, feeling the tight coil in my chest loosen just a bit. "I'm tired of pretending," I said. They tried to bury me, but I kept the receipts. Word spread fast. My tenants, who'd seen the sudden surge of suspicious inspectors and anonymous calls, rallied behind me. They sent letters of support, notes of gratitude for the repairs I'd made, the upgrades I'd funded, the patience I'd shown. My partners called with messages that mixed disbelief with admiration. In the space of a day, the narrative shifted. Marcel's name, once whispered like a golden ticket, suddenly felt tarnished. People who'd sat at his table, who'd praised his charm, now glanced at him with suspicion. The truth had a way of sticking like tar to your shoes, no matter how carefully you walked. Alina called that night. Her voice was soft, hesitant. The confidence I'd once found attractive now stripped raw. "I didn't know it would go this far," she said. "I thought Dad was just protecting the family." "Protecting the family," I repeated. "The bitterness coating my tongue by destroying me?" "I didn't know," she whispered. "We can fix this." I leaned back in my chair, letting the darkness of the room wrap around me like armor. "Fix what? Me or the story you told everyone about me?" She fell silent, and for a moment, I could hear her breathing, shallow, uneven. "I'm sorry," she said finally. "I didn't know." I thought about the dinners, the laughter in the dining room that never included me, the subtle ways they'd made me feel like an intruder in my own marriage. The times she'd let their jokes slide, never standing up for me, never asking why I was always the one expected to smile and take it. "You didn't want to know," I said. "That's the difference." Silence stretched between us until it frayed at the edges. I didn't hang up. I let the silence speak for me. Let her sit in the truth she'd avoided for so long. In the days that followed, the fallout came fast and hard. The city council put a quiet pause on one of Marcel's biggest projects. No explanation given, but the whispers said everything. Investors pulled out of another development, citing reputational risk. His phone calls, once a ticket to influence, now rang unanswered. Me, I kept working. I met with my tenants, answered their questions, reassured them that their homes and my company were safe. I shook hands with city inspectors, handed over every document they asked for, and watched them nod, impressed by my meticulous records. Because that was the thing they'd never understood about me. I'd built this empire brick by brick, detail by detail, never taking a shortcut I couldn't defend. They thought they could scare me with whispers. They thought I'd run. But the truth was, I've been waiting for them to come for me. I've been waiting to show them what happened when you tried to cut down a man who'd spent his life learning how to stand tall. Their empire cracked fast, like a dam, finally giving way under pressure it never believed would come. The call started at dawn, the ones they'd never thought they'd have to answer. Lawyers, investors, developers, suddenly worried about the shine on Marcel's name. I didn't have to say a word. The evidence I'd laid out in the business times did the talking for me. One by one, the permits tied to his latest pet project downtown got pulled. The city council, all hush-hush, sent him polite but devastating notices. "We regret to inform you that your permit is under review." I knew the language well. I'd written it myself once in a different context. Words that sound neutral but might as well have been a noose. Terrence called me from his car, the roar of wind on the speaker. "Marcel's getting burned alive out there," he said. The disbelief mingled with satisfaction. Half the council's already talking about severing ties. The rest? They're scared. Nobody wants to be the next name on your list. I leaned back in my chair, the sun streaming through the window, warm against my arms. "Good," I said. He thought he could take me down with half-truths and threats. He didn't think I'd be ready. "He's not the only one who underestimated you," Terrence added, his tone heavy. "You're making a lot of people rethink how they do business. Keep that in mind." I ended the call and sat for a moment, listening to the hum of the city outside. The street below was alive with people going about their day, oblivious to the silent war that had raged behind closed doors. I felt the weight of it all. Years of biting my tongue, of letting them treat me like the guy who didn't belong at the table. That night, I was reading emails in my apartment when there was a knock on the door. It wasn't polite or cautious. It was desperate. 3 short raps that told me everything I needed to know. I got up, the floor cool under my bare feet, and opened the door. Alina stood there, tears on her cheeks, mascara smudged like war paint. "Can I come in?" she asked, her voice small. I didn't move. "What do you want, Alina?" She wiped her eyes and glanced around the hallway like a woman hunted. "I didn't know it would go this far," she whispered. "Dad, he's a mess. Mom won't talk to anyone. The permits, the investors, everything's falling apart. We didn't know you'd do this." "Do what?" I asked, folding my arms across my chest. "Defend myself. Tell the truth." Her lip trembled. "We didn't think you'd turn on us." The words landed like a slap. "Turn on you?" I echoed a laugh, building in my throat. "You all turned on me years ago. Every time they called me blue-collar lucky. Every time they invited me in through the back door. Every time they laughed at me in the kitchen while they toasted themselves in the dining room. I was never one of you. You made sure of that." She shook her head, tears dripping onto her blouse. "I didn't know." "No," I interrupted, my voice calm but sharp enough to slice through any lie she'd rehearsed. "You didn't want to know. That's the difference." She stared at me like she just realized she didn't know who I was. Maybe she never had. I thought we could fix this. We could try again. Be us. I let out a breath, the last of my anger dissolving into something quieter, colder. Fix what? Me or the story you told everyone about me? I shook my head. "I don't need fixing, Alina. I never did. I needed you to stand beside me. You couldn't." Her eyes shone in the dim light of the hallway. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I really am." I believe that. But sorry doesn't heal a broken bone. It just points at the fracture and says, that shouldn't have happened. She took a step closer, her hand outstretched. "Please, let's talk. Just you and me." I stepped back. "No," her hand dropped. "So that's it? That's it?" I said, my voice steady. You don't get to rewrite the story now. You chose your side. You let them decide who I was. Now you can live with it. She stood there for a moment, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Then she turned and walked away, her steps echoing down the hallway like a farewell. When the door clicked shut behind me, I exhaled and let the silence fill the room. I felt lighter, like a weight I'd carried for too long had finally lifted. The next day, Terrence called again. Heard Marcel's investors are threatening lawsuits, he said, the smile in his voice unmistakable. He's scrambling. I'd say the king's castle is crumbling. I leaned back, the chair creaking. Good, I said. Let him feel what he put me through. Because this was never just about one dinner or one insult. This was about every time they made me feel small, every time they thought they could keep me in the kitchen while they raised their glasses in the dining room. It was my turn now, and I wasn't going to let them forget it. I sat at the lawyer's office, the windows tinted to block out the midday glare. Papers spread across the mahogany desk. Each page a record of promises broken, of trust eroded by laughter that had always been at my expense. My lawyer, a woman named Evelyn with sharp eyes and a voice that never trembled, slid the final draft across to me. It's straightforward, she said. No shared assets, no alimony, no claims on your properties. Clean break. I let the word sink in. Clean break. It sounded antiseptic, like a surgical wound that wouldn't bleed. I picked up the pen and hovered over the line that said, Signature. For a moment, I saw Elena's face, the way her eyes used to light up at the smallest kindness, the way she'd held my hand at the courthouse the day we'd signed the marriage certificate. I thought then that marriage was a partnership, a safe place where honesty lived. But that was before I learned that some families treat trust like a trick, a way to let you get close enough to twist the knife. I pressed the pen to the paper and signed my name. It felt final, like the last chapter of a book I'd outgrown. Evelyn nodded, her lips tight but approving. That's it, she said. She'll be served by end of day. I leaned back, the leather of the chair creaking under my weight. My mind wandered to that Thanksgiving dinner, to the way Elena's father had offered me a seat at his table with one hand and tried to cut my legs out from under me with the other. The way Elena had watched it happen and said nothing. Every polite laugh, every look of pity like I was the poor man lucky to have married their daughter. As if love was some lottery ticket they'd given me out of charity. But the thing was, I'd never been the lucky one. I'd been the one who made his own luck, who turned every insult into fuel. And now, as Evelyn gathered the papers into a neat stack, I felt that same fire. Quiet, but unstoppable. Elena had texted me earlier. We can talk about this. We can work it out. But I knew what that meant. Work it out was another way of saying, pretend it never happened. Another way of pulling me back into the shadows. While they laughed in the light, I stood and slid my jacket over my shoulders. Evelyn handed me a slim manila envelope. This is a copy for your records, she said. I'll have a courier deliver the official documents to her. I nodded. Thanks. She hesitated, her eyes softening. If you need anything, I've got it, I said, cutting her off gently. I didn't need sympathy. I didn't need anyone to tell me I'd done the right thing. I knew it. The sky outside was a bruised gray, the clouds thick with rain that hadn't yet fallen. I walked down the sidewalk, every step feeling deliberate, as if I were crossing a bridge to a place I'd longed for without even knowing it. My phone buzzed again. Elena. I let it ring. At home, I poured myself a glass of that same aged scotch I brought to Thanksgiving, the bottle now half empty. I set it on the counter, its amber glow catching the light like a small sun. The memory of that night was still fresh. The way I'd stood in the kitchen while they laughed in the dining room. The way her mother had called me Frank, like I was a caterer. That scotch had been a peace offering then. Now it was a victory toast. I lifted the glass to my lips and let the warmth slide down my throat. The bitterness wasn't just the liquor. It was the history, the quiet acceptance of every slide I'd endured. I'd spent years letting them tell me who I was supposed to be. Now, with every sip, I reclaimed a piece of myself. The divorce clause was simple. No alimony, no spousal claims, no settlement. Every asset I built remained mine. Every building, every tenant, every contract, they were mine because I'd earned them. She could keep her name, her parties, her dinners under the chandelier. I'd keep my empire. The phone rang again, persistent. I let it ring. I'd learned that sometimes silence was the only answer that mattered. Later that night, I sat at my kitchen table. The divorce papers spread out in front of me. The lines blurred slightly, a combination of the scotch and the weight of it all. I thought about the man I'd been when I married her. A man who believed that family was about showing up for each other. That if you worked hard enough, you'd earn their respect. That if you loved someone enough, they'd stand by you, and the world turned cold. But the truth was, respect couldn't be earned from people who'd already decided you weren't enough. In love, real love didn't ask you to shrink so someone else could stand taller. I picked up the pen again and signed the final page. It felt like an exorcism. The man I'd been the man who let them define him died with that signature. I boxed up the wedding photos, the anniversary cards, the souvenirs of a marriage that had been more performance than partnership. I set the box by the door. Maybe I'd donate it. Maybe I'd let it gather dust in the back of the closet. Either way, I'd moved on. The next morning, Evelyn called to confirm the papers had been delivered. She didn't contest it, she said, just signed. I closed my eyes, letting the relief flood in. Good, I whispered, because I was done fighting for a place at their table. I'd built my own table, stronger, wider, with a seat for anyone who treated me like I belonged. I raised the glass of scotch one more time, the amber liquid reflecting the early morning light. I thought about the man who'd walked into that Thanksgiving dinner, his bottle of scotch in hand, thinking he was bringing a gift to a family who'd always considered him the help. But I wasn't the help. I was the man who owned the house they lived in, the man who'd signed every deed, every check, every promise. And as I took that last sip, I realized something. They'd given me exactly what I needed. Proof that I didn't belong in their world, and the strength to build my own. 1 year later, I stood at the threshold of a building I'd transformed from a crumbling shell into a place that breathed with life. It was Thanksgiving again. But this time, the gathering wasn't held in someone else's home. It was in mine, a community center that doubled as affordable housing, a place where families who had never been offered a seat at the table could finally gather without fear of being turned away. The foyer smelled of warm bread and spiced cider, the air alive with laughter and the shuffle of children's shoes on freshly waxed floors. My team had decorated the place with autumn leaves, paper turkeys made by local kids, and a simple banner that read, "Welcome home." And that's exactly what it was. A home, even if it wasn't a house. Terrence showed up first, his wife on his arm, both of them carrying a pie that smelled of bourbon and caramel. He gave me that familiar grin as he extended the box. "This place looks incredible," he said, his eyes sweeping the high ceilings and exposed brick walls. "You did this." I shook his hand firmly. "No," I said, gesturing toward the families filing in behind him. We did this. A young mother approached, her little girl clinging to her skirt. "Thank you for inviting us," she said shilly. "It means a lot." I smiled, bending to the girl's level. "I'm glad you're here," I said, meaning every word. As the room filled, I saw faces that reminded me why I'd built this place. A man who'd just gotten off a double shift at the warehouse. A woman who'd finally left a bad marriage. Kids with eyes wide open, ready for a new start. They didn't know the full story of how I'd gotten here. But they felt the warmth, the welcome, and that was enough. I watched the door as people arrived. Some familiar, some new. But this time, I stood at the front. I didn't need to sneak around the side or be ushered through a service entrance. I own the building, and I own every brick in the foundation. The weight of that truth settled on me like armor. No Alina, no Marcel, no Cynthia. Their seats were empty, their invitations never sent. This was a table for people who respected each other, who knew that family was something you built, not something you demanded. I thought about the man I'd been last year. The one who'd walked through the kitchen door, shoulders heavy with the burden of trying to prove himself to people who'd never cared. That man was gone. In his place stood someone who'd learned the hardest lesson. You can't force people to see your worth. You can only build it brick by brick until it stands so tall they can't ignore it. Terence raised a glass of cider. "To second chances," he said, his voice carrying across the room and to the man who gave us all a seat at his table. The room erupted in cheers, the sound swelling like a wave that carried every heart with it. I felt something shift inside me, an old pain loosening its grip, a final sigh of relief. I raised my own glass, the cider crisp and cool in my hand. To us, I said to every one of us who decided that family isn't something you're born into. It's something you choose. I looked around the room at every face illuminated by the warm glow of hanging lights. And I felt a pride that had nothing to do with money or status. This was the empire I'd built. Not a tower of glass and steel, but a place where laughter echoed down hallways that once stood empty, where every door opened to possibility. And this time, I walked everyone in through the front door, including myself. Because the only door I entered now was one I owned.